Hello, my name is Jean Mizutani, and I'm the Senior Education Specialist here at INCLUDEnyc. Welcome and thank you for coming. Today's topic is charter schools and students with disabilities. This is one of a series of live streams that we conduct on the third Thursday of each month during the school year. We start promptly at noon and we run up to 60 minutes. If you have questions, we're going to offer a chat box. Please go ahead and chat. We'll do our best to answer them. We've also sent out an information packet. I hope you've received it by your email. If not, at the bottom of the screen is a link. You can click now and get that packet to review later. Today's guest is Nelson Marr, a senior staff attorney and education law specialist at Bronx Legal Services. Welcome, Nelson.
Thank you, Jean. It's a pleasure to be here.
And I'm very excited to have you here because charter schools are a subject that we get lots and lots of questions about. That is not surprising since I hear there are 120,000 students in charter schools. So let's start with the basics. What are charter schools?
Sure. Charter schools refer to privately run public schools in New York State. These are schools that have been allowed to be created by private entities, mainly not-for-profit corporations, and essentially they're run by not-for-profit boards to run public schools in New York State.
Okay, so that means they have a charter. What is a charter?
Well, charter is really just a term for these types of schools that are created through this process where a private entity, seeks authorization from three different authorizers in New York State. That's the New York State Education Department, the New York City Department of Education, and the State University of New York. These three authorizing agencies will take proposals from these private groups and decide whether or not to issue them this right to open up a public charter school.
So the charter is a proposal or a kind of work plan?
Yes, and essentially all these schools, they do have to submit an application. These applications, when they're applying to become a charter school, these applications are available for public review.
So I imagine that these work plans vary. I'm assuming it's important for parents to know what the charter at their child's school says.
Yes, so schools oftentimes, when they go through this process, they have to show, when charter schools are applying to get their charter, they have to show how they're going to meet the needs of the community that they intend to serve, what's the mission of the school. This information usually can be found on the charter school's website. In the past, they used to have the charter school's application available at the State Education Department's website, but that no longer exists. But I would certainly say if parents are interested in charter schools, they should definitely do their investigation, and that should include looking at the charter school's website, possibly even going to visit the charter school, and going to some of these other websites like InsideSchools.org, where they do some reviews of schools, including charter schools.
Right, those are very helpful actually. Everybody likes them. Good
Yes.
insight into the schools. Tell us a little bit about the history of charter schools.
Yes, so charter schools is not really a new thing. It's been around for close to, actually over 20 years now. Originally started around 1998. The initial movement for charter schools really came from local communities, and it stemmed from disappointment in the lack of options available in especially poor performing school communities. Parents and community members wanted to create more options for their children, and that really spurred the initial charter school movement. But of late, it's really mushroomed, so we've gone from a very small number of charter schools to now close to 400, probably well over 400 soon. charter schools in New York State.
Right. So this all started basically because parents wanted an alternative to failing public schools.
Yes.
Is that fair to say?
Yes. A lot of communities saw that year after year, the schools that they were sending their children to were underperforming, were getting on lists where they needed to be reorganized, and they felt that the system wasn't working to their child's advantage. So they really pushed for a new path, the charter school path, where they could have potentially say in creating schools that met their children's needs.
Right. So it's an emotional investment, and you can see why the charter school topic is emotionally charged.
Yes.
It's also controversial.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah, let's talk about what supporters say and what opponents say, because there's an awful lot to say.
Yes, and certainly, as we just mentioned before, charter schools really came from a place where parents and community members were looking to improve the schools in their communities. And they thought the best way to do that was to go outside of the public school system and to create schools. And certainly that is the promise of a lot of these charter schools, because that history of underperforming and poor performing schools continues. And many of the charter school proponents will argue, and rightfully so, that there are very few good options in a lot of the communities that charter schools have opened up in. And these charter schools promise, innovation, high academic achievement, and the ability to do things that public schools can't do.
Right, and you can understand the excitement of the parent that wins a lottery,
Yes.
even the language winning a lottery.
Yes, it is truly a significant achievement to win the lottery, because a lot of these charter schools receive hundreds, if not thousands, of applications for a limited number of seats.
It's amazing. Now, what about opponents of charter schools?
Yes, there is a lot of criticism about charter schools currently. A lot of them stem around exclusion of students with disabilities, or lack of enrollment of children who are English language learners. There's also concern about discipline practices being too much on the side of zero tolerance, and in a manner where they ultimately push kids out of these schools. There's also concern that charter schools, because they receive public funding, they are taking money away from needy public schools. And certainly there's also the issue about charter schools being a threat to just the whole overall public education system.
Wow. So I understand that some charter schools are huge networks and others are established by small community-based organizations. What's the difference?
Yes, there's a wide variety of charter schools options out there. As you mentioned, there are some charter schools that belong to very large charter school networks. Some of the biggest ones include Success Academy charter schools, Achievement First charter schools, and KIPS. Success Academy operates 40 plus schools in New York City, Achievement First close to 20, and KIP about 13 or 14. So that's significant. That's larger than many school districts in the country. And that, because of that, there's tends to be maybe a little bit more uniformity. They have to sort of follow the practices within that network. Whereas a smaller school, like the charter school for the charter high school for law and social justice up in the Bronx, is a standalone school, and that has more of a focus on law and trying to give high school students an opportunity to experience what work in the field of law could be like in the future. And so yes, they a big charter school network and a small charter school standalone can have different focuses, and it would be good for parents to do that investigation that we talked about if they're interested.
People can understand that a huge organization would demand uniformity, and that a small one has more opportunity for flexibility. Is that right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so they can be more responsive to the community in effect because they have flexibility.
Yes, I would agree with that.
Okay. We hear a lot about cultural competence. It's an important concept in education these days. What is it, and are charter schools being successful in developing these practices?
So cultural competence, as you mentioned, Jean, it's very much a hot topic in education circles, especially for immigrant and minority communities. Certainly, cultural competence in schools refers to the ability of school staff to educate children in an environment that meets their social, emotional, and cultural needs. And this is something I certainly encourage parents of children with disabilities to consider and to think about when you're selecting a charter school. As we talked about before, we're talking about many different charter schools with many different mission statements, with many different cultures. And you want to make sure that the charter school that you're looking at has a culture that recognizes children of different abilities and children with different academic and emotional needs, and that's what we're talking about when we talk about cultural competence.
Okay, so it's just another good pointer for parents to keep in mind when they're seeking a charter school, to be aware of the environment, the culture. There's a long list of things they're going to have
Yes.
by the time they're finished listening to us today. It's wonderful to have this conversation because we hear all the time and we know that charter schools are public schools, but it appears that there are real differences in the way charters operate in comparison to the typical public schools. What is the same and what is different?
So the principal difference is that charter schools are free from complying with a lot of the state regulations and rules that public schools typically are required to follow. That is the large difference, and that allows charter schools to potentially have a longer school day, or to have schools operating for maybe 10, 11, or even 12 months out of the school year, out of the year, the calendar year. And so so there are significant differences between a charter school and a public school, and it's mainly with regards to charter schools not having to follow a lot of the school rules.
Right. Now, when we say they don't have to follow rules and regulations, we immediately think of the good things, but there are some problems inherent to that as well. What regulations are they exempt from following?
So a lot of the regulations that involve like academic, well, one very important point to pay attention to is that charter schools are not required to follow the New York City Chancellor's regulations. So that's a question I get often when I talk to parents who are interested in charter schools. They often ask, are charter schools required to follow the Chancellor's regulations? And the simple answer is no. Those regulations only apply to New York City public schools. There are significant rules around like promotion that apply to public schools, and charter schools don't have to follow those rules. There's also separate rules around discipline, and there are certain parts of that charter schools are also not required to follow as well.
Many parents are truly surprised to hear that.
Yes, I think that's not necessarily discussed a lot in the materials that charter schools present. But I think it's also important to point out that charter schools do also have to follow certain federal and state laws as well. And some of the more important ones that they do have to follow are the civil rights laws. So charter schools are prohibited, just like any other school, public school, from discriminating against both students, staff, and parents on the basis of race, gender, national origin, disability status, and nationality.
We'll hear more about that later. Most of the families that we work with have children with disabilities or suspected disabilities, so they usually want to know, are there any restrictions or limits to what kind of services can be provided at a charter school?
There are no limits. Charter schools, as we mentioned before, can really craft their approach and their school in the manner that they wish, as long as it's within the that it's not non-discriminatory. And when it comes to providing special education services, there's no limit to what they can do. So if they wanted to provide a small class programs in their school, they can do that.
Mm-hmm.
If they wanted to provide speech and language therapists in each and every class, they can do that. So the sky's the limit.
It's good to know. So legal guidance does say that charters are required to implement the IEP, but it doesn't really drill down on what happens if a program isn't available. What happens then? Because we get a call like that a lot. An IEP has been changed, a parent wants a full-time special ed class, the school is saying we can't provide that, and yet we hear they have to implement the IEP, so there is confusion.
Yes. So just to back up a little bit, the guiding document for any child with a disability is the child's IEP, which is the Individualized Education Program for that child. In New York State, if your child is attending a charter school, the IEP is created by the school district that you live in. Okay, so if your child is going to charter school A, the group that is going to develop the IEP is the school district that you live in, not the charter school. So if that IEP calls for like a small class program and that charter school A cannot provide it, in New York State, there's one of two things that can happen in that situation. That charter school can ask the school district to provide it additional funds to create that program and provide that program in the charter school. Or charter school A could let the district know that they cannot provide that program, and then the district will be responsible for finding another placement for that child so that the child can receive what the IEP is recommending.
Right. Now that's really a tough situation because, as you pointed out before, some parents are trying to avoid a failing public school. They go to the charter school. Then if a child needs a certain level of service and the charter school isn't prepared to develop that on site, sends the child back to the district school.
Yes, that's absolutely true. I have quite a few clients. I work in the South, most of my clients are from the South Bronx. And unfortunately, there's been a long history of poor performing schools, and many of my clients who are in charter schools and are having difficulties, they don't want to leave the charter school because
Right.
they see the promise that it potentially holds for their child, the opportunities that they don't think they could have gotten in the local community school. So they desperately do want their child to remain, and if their child's IEP recommends services that the school cannot provide, oftentimes they will try to work with the school, the charter school, to find a middle ground where maybe they would get something similar
Right.
to that, and but it doesn't always work.
Wow. So you mentioned before that the district creates and authorizes the IEP. So that would be the Committee on Special Education, in everyday language. Most families are accustomed now to going to the IEP team in their school if it's a public school, but charter is the exception. So they'd be going to the Committee on Special Education, correct?
That's absolutely true, Jean. And New York City has broken its committees on special education and configured it in a very
Unique.
challenging way. It's broken up into regions, so you should go to the New York City Department of Education's website and look for the Committee on Special Education for where you live.
Right. Now, you said that charter schools are seen as one of the schools in a district. So this makes it clear that the overarching responsibility for the special education process and also the provision of services is the district's. Is that right?
That's correct. So charter schools can operate in one of two ways. They can be their own school district under special education, or they could be a school within a school district, and that's what New York State has chosen. So all charter schools in New York State are considered public schools of the school district where the child resides for purposes of special education. So for everything else, the charter school is considered its own school district, but for special education, the charter school is considered no different than like PS1 in District 1.
Right. So although it sounds terrible to someone like me to think that a student in a charter school would have to return to his own school because they didn't have a program, the same thing in theory could happen to a student in a public school.
That's true, yes. We see that often. I see that in many of my clients' cases where they're not happy, at PS 25, and largely because they're not getting either the paraprofessional services or there's no speech and language services. In those situations, a lot of times that student needs to go to a different school to get those services.
So the services have to be made available by the district, but not necessarily in any one specific place.
That's correct, yes.
What is the parent's role in the special education process?
So the parent, under the law, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, is considered somewhat of an equal participant in the special education process, and it is vital that the parent participate and contribute to the development of the IEP that we talked about. So that means attending the meeting, letting the IEP team know what the child's strengths, weaknesses are, areas that the parent would like the school to work on with the child. And the responsibilities extend further than just that meeting. It means also staying on top of what's happening with your child throughout the school year. And that includes checking in with your child, checking in with your child's teachers, keeping a tab on the child's progress. It's only through that can you know if the services are working. And if you realize the services aren't working, the sooner you catch it, the better. And then you can start the new process of possibly getting different services for your child.
Okay, so if you wanted something new to happen, for example, you wanted a reevaluation or some other step taken, who really should lead that request? Is it the parent or is it the representative at the charter school?
So I would say the responsibility is equal, because certainly school officials have more direct knowledge about what's happening at school, and sometimes that information doesn't filter down to the parent. So school officials should certainly raise this concern with the Committee on Special Education. We're talking about charter schools here. The school officials at the charter schools should raise that concern and should then make sure also the parent is aware that they're raising this concern as well. Parents likewise can, if they have concerns, they don't need to wait for the school to make that notice to the Committee on Special Education. They themselves can make that request to the Committee on Special Education for either a new IEP meeting, new testing, etc.
Yeah, I think it's very important for the parent to know that they don't have to go only through the liaison at the charter school, that they can go to the Committee on Special Education themselves. I've heard, for example, many situations where a request has been made by the liaison at the charter school, but the CSE hasn't been responsive and a lot of time is passing. Is there any reason the parent shouldn't intervene in a case like that?
Absolutely no reason. Parents should, as we just mentioned, stay on top of their child's education. As soon as there are issues, they should certainly raise it at the school and certainly at the Committee on Special Education. Shouldn't have to wait too long for a response. So if you're not getting a response,
Right.
please follow up. I always recommend to my clients to put things in writing. So if you're making a request to the Committee on Special Education for a new IEP meeting, do it in an email or do it in a handwritten letter. And you can fax it, you could scan it and email it, etc.
Yeah, I think the takeaway here is be involved. Don't just tell the liaison of the charter school and assume that it's happening.
Yes.
Be in the loop, be involved.
Yeah, you cannot rely on school officials. That's true whether it's charter or public. We find that
Stay in the loop.
exactly that school administrators, even though some who are well-intentioned and some ill-intentioned, you can't rely on them.
Right. So a few moments ago we were talking about the fact that charter schools don't have to follow the Chancellor's regulations. Idea is totally different, correct?
Yes. So Chancellor's regulations is again just different rules that the Chancellor of the New York City Department of Education has put in place for its schools to follow. The IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, is the federal law that provides money to school districts to provide special education services. So every school district that receives it has to follow the rules and the regulations that is in the IDEA. And since all charter schools receive federal money and has said yes, as far as I'm aware, they too have to follow the rules and regulations of the IDEA.
So this also includes the opportunity to pursue due process about a special education issue.
Yes. So under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, parents have the opportunity to challenge school decisions or the district's decisions regarding their child's special education services. They can do that in a number of different ways. They can do it informally. They could go to the school district, like we mentioned before, ask for new meetings or say they want to change. Then there are more formal ways to do it. You can request mediation. There are mediation centers throughout the city where you can go and request mediation with the school district in this case, or even the school, around a special education issue. In that situation, you'll sit down with a mediator, someone who's tasked to try to bring two sides together, you, the school district or the school, and try to hammer out an agreement. And if you do come to an agreement, that agreement is put into writing and becomes a legal contract. Then another formal way to challenge decisions, you can request an impartial hearing. So every parent has a right to request an administrative hearing. In New York City, it's called an impartial hearing. There you go before an impartial hearing officer who acts like a judge, who's going to hear information from both yourself and the school district and decide who's right and issue a decision like a judge.
So this is about special education disputes. I
Yes.
just want to be clear.
Yes. Oh, and certainly mediation is also available for all other disputes. So
Right.
it's not only mediation is not only for
special ed,
education.
right? But for our intents and purposes,
Yes.
that's what we're talking about. Because many parents will say, "I have a problem. How do I escalate?" And if it's a special education issue, then they have the
Yes.
right to pursue due
Yes.
process. This is actually what I was looking for before when I asked you about parent leadership, because parents often don't understand that they have the standing to take these steps. They think it's all up to the school, all in their hands, and it's not. Parents have the standing.
Yes. Parents have an absolute right to challenge these decisions or these changes that are happening with regards to their child's special education services. And actually there's another process that I forgot to mention. Any special education disagreement can can be brought to the state education commissioner. So there's a separate process where a parent can file a state complaint with the state education commissioner around special education. So if there's an issue at, like, say, charter school B, and it involves like the provision of speech and language therapy services, you can bring that complaint to the state education department.
Right. So I've noticed that the state does have a copy of a book called Procedural Safeguards.
Yes.
So if parents want to learn more, they can check that out at the state website. There's so much information, more than we could go over in 1 hour. Not every student needs an IEP. There are some students with disabilities that would benefit from a 504 accommodation plan. Tell us a little bit about those.
Sure. Section 504, which is what is the law behind a 504 plan. This law is an anti-discrimination law. It's a federal law that says any agency that receives federal money cannot discriminate against a person with a disability. And generally, that means in the school setting, beyond non-discrimination, it also means that schools have to provide reasonable accommodations for children with disabilities. And oftentimes, we see that in 504 plans about medication management. So if a child with asthma may need his or her asthma medication during the day, it would come through a 504 plan. Or if a child who needs help ambulating in the school environment and may need access to the elevator, then there would be a 504 plan for that child to access the elevator. So typically, this is something that's available for children who have disabilities, but those disabilities do not rise to the level where they severely impact his or her education. So in those situations, children aren't eligible for special education services, but they can be eligible for 504 services. And those 504 services can be pretty broad. So in some situations, a child who may have like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder could get a 504 plan for testing accommodations, could get a 504 plan for a paraprofessional, for an adult to help, make sure the child maintains focus in class, ensure that the child, doesn't get into situations due to his or her impulsivity. So 504 can be a good tool to use if your child is found ineligible for special education services.
If your child is found ineligible for special education services. That's interesting.
Yes. So if your child is found eligible for special education services, you cannot receive 504 services. Well, actually, let me rephrase that. So if your child is found eligible for special education services, if you refuse those special education services, the school district doesn't have a responsibility to give you those same services under 504.
I didn't know that. That's very interesting. Where does a parent make a request if they want to discuss the 504 plan?
They need to go to the school. So in this situation, the duty is on the school. So if your child is attending charter school B, then you need to go to charter school B to have that conversation about possibly getting a 504 plan for your child. If A, he or she has a disability and that disability requires some accommodation in school so that the child can access the school like regular children.
School-based. Okay, that's good information. Tell me a little about the rights of students that are English language learners.
So under federal law, students, and under New York State law, students who are English language learners have the right to access education despite the fact that they may not be English proficient. So they should be able to receive English language learner services in the charter schools as well.
Okay, that's great. So there's a big elephant in the room. I'm going to ask you about some problems that we hear from some parents whose children attend charter schools. We sometimes hear that students are being asked to repeat a grade or even to return to an earlier grade. Now that really shocks us to think that someone could be in the third grade in January and then be told by the school, we want you to go back to the second grade because you're not doing well.
Yes. This actually is a fairly significant issue. I've dealt with it very directly. In fact, I'm in federal court on this issue, specifically against a charter school. But the rules are somewhat opaque here, because again, as we mentioned at the outset, charter schools don't have to comply with a lot of the rules and regulations that New York State has for typical public schools. So I would recommend that parents look at whatever information they can get on the charter school, including the family handbook, and certainly look at their mission statement on their website to determine what their policies are with regards to promotion, retention, and in the more rare circumstances, demotion, where a child is sent from a current grade to a prior grade that the child had already completed. So, but for children with disabilities, I think that there are particular protections that can be available in these situations. So on a child's IEP, if your child has an IEP, you can probably find that section where it talks about promotion criteria. And there, there's the possibility where you can build in, some standards for how the school will treat promotion for your child. There are also things that you can write into the child's IEP to ensure that the child doesn't get held back simply because they're not getting the right services.
Okay, so this seems a little difficult for the parent because it's a two-tier system, so to speak. It could be a special education issue, in which case you might be working with your district or you might even be pursuing due process, but it also could be an internal escalation process within the school, correct?
That's true, yes. So every school has typically their own promotion policy, the detention policy. That is separate from the special education process that is, again, the responsibility of the school district, the Committee on Special Education. So the parent may have to deal with the school first, at the outset,
Right.
But it's also something to be mindful of when you're sitting down for the IEP. So if your child is entering a school and you know this ahead of time and you're at the IEP meeting before your child starts at that charter school, then you might want to think about how that IEP should be structured to account for potentially the academic rigors of the new charter
Preventive.
School. Yes.
I like it, preventive steps. Disciplinary issues can also be a real sticking point.
Yes, and again, this is something that charter schools have a little bit more flexibility on. A lot of the charter schools don't believe that they have to follow Section 3014 of the New York State Education Law. That's the law that provides guidance to schools in New York State, public schools in New York State, on how student discipline should occur. And we've seen in a lot of media stories and also a lot of personal cases that I've handled where schools use the discipline process quite exorbitantly, where children are suspended, multiple times in a month and are out, and it becomes an issue because a lot of charter schools don't have the ability to provide a full school day for that child when they're suspended, so they only have the child come in for an hour or two of instruction, and that's a significant difference when you talk about a school a charter school's normal day is like 8 or 9 hours, and the child's only coming in for 2 hours.
Mm-hmm.
So certainly, it's understandable that this will have an academic impact in the long term.
You're saying schools don't think that they have to abide by that law.
That's correct, and currently it is being challenged, and it's been raised in some of the legal cases that are out there right now against some of the charter schools.
Okay, so maybe we'll get a conclusion in time. We're hoping.
Yes.
You mentioned suspension. Talk a little more about that.
Sure. So typically when a child is suspended, schools have the option to either suspend the child within the school or suspend the child out of school. Under New York State education law, and I believe this applies to all students at every school, every public school, whether it's a regular public school or a charter school. They are then entitled to education during that period of suspension. So if the child is suspended within school, they should be in a classroom where they're receiving instruction during that time of suspension. If the child's suspended outside of the school, they should be receiving instruction as well. So what typically happens in New York City public schools, when a child is suspended out of school, they're sent to an alternative learning center. And so that's usually a separate school for children who are suspended. And but a lot of charter schools, they suspend a child. They say they can't come to school. They're only entitled to come to the charter school for like maybe an hour or two, and they'll receive that instruction, then they have to go home.
Are they ineligible for the alternative public setting?
Again, the alternative learning centers, that's only for New York City public schools. That's the structure that's created by New York City public schools. Nothing prevents charter schools from doing something like that. I've certainly suggested that charter schools could come together to create these alternative learning centers. I mean, separate charter school entities could do that and provide full-day instruction for these children. I understand some of the challenges for doing that on their end, especially if you're a smaller charter school. If you're a standalone charter school, or if you're a smaller charter school network.
It's very difficult. Now, I hate to use a word like expulsion. It sounds so draconian. Does that occur?
Yes, expulsion is the most serious type of disciplinary response that a school can take. In New York State, that should be limited to the most egregious types of actions. Charter school students have a right to stay in their charter school. If the charter school wants to expel a child, they have to go through a formal process. It involves an expulsion hearing. That hearing should be before someone who acts like a judge who makes that decision. But there should also be a record of that meeting so that the parent could have the proper documentation about what happened at the meeting so that they can challenge that expulsion if they wish to do so.
Wow. So I think it's very hard for parents to determine how should I approach this problem. Is it a special education issue? Is it an issue about the way the school is being managed? How should they proceed?
That's a very good question, Jean. I think it's challenging because we all know, children, their formative years is a very short period of time. Some of these processes that we're talking about, expulsion, suspensions, can take, can span over multiple months, and then the process to challenge them can take months as well. And so during that period of time, it's very disruptive and very difficult for parents and students. So a lot of my clients, they've taken the position that it's too much, and so a good number of them have pulled their children out, as opposed to going through the whole entire process to challenge either the suspension or the expulsion. If these issues do involve the child's receipt of special education services, then certainly the parent can use the due process procedures we talked about, mediation, a state complaint, or an impartial hearing to try to address these issues with discipline and expulsion.
Right. I just want to say I think mediation is a wonderful solution because you're attracting a lot of attention to the issue. And instead of it just being between the family and the school, there's other people involved, and people seem to try harder in a setting like that to reach an agreement which is, acceptable to all. So I think that's a good path. Too bad it's not guaranteed, not a slam dunk. Too bad about that. I just want to stop for a moment because there's a question there about a list of charter schools that provide related services. Now, you would assume that just about all charter schools do provide related services, wouldn't you?
Yes, and this comes back to the earlier question about implementing the IEP. So any charter school that has a student with an IEP, that charter school is required to implement the IEP. So if the IEP says the child needs XYZ related services, that school has to ensure the child receives them. Ultimately, the school district is responsible for funding those related services, but the school also is responsible for ensuring that the child gets those related services. So, so every charter school should be ensuring that related services are being provided to their students with IEPs.
Now, when you say ensuring, again, the devil is in the details language. So ensuring means they're taking proactive efforts to make sure this happens, but I guess there's no 100% certainty that it happens in the school during the school day. If that were the case, what would happen?
So if it's not happening, then again, parents can use the processes that we outlined before to raise a complaint. They can go to the state education department, they can ask for mediation, they can do it informally, go to the school, go to the Committee on Special Education.
Right, go to the Committee on Special Education.
And certainly I would recommend starting with the Committee on Special Education first.
Right. Are there situations where they might provide the parent with a related service voucher in that case?
Yes. We do see the Committees on Special Education resorting to that solution often.
Resorting.
Yes, and in some ways, a lot of us advocates feel it's a really imperfect resolution to this issue because anyone who's gotten an RSA, a related service authorization, knows it's challenging to find providers.
And schedule, yes.
Yes, and that leaves the onus on the parent to, as you mentioned, to do the scheduling, to not only find the provider, but then find a time that works with your schedule, your child's schedule, and the provider's schedule.
Right, but in this case, that would be exactly the same as in the traditional public schools.
That's
so
true.
At least they're no worse off there.
No. But again, I think the bigger issue is staying on top of whether or not your child is getting the related service.
Right. Now, earlier we made clear that charter schools don't follow the Chancellor's regs, and we did talk about regulations that they do have to follow. But do you mind going down this one more time, because there is a question about what regulations charter schools need to follow?
Yes. So the regulations with regards to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, they have to follow that. That's a federal law that applies to all schools that receive the IDEA funding. They have to follow the anti-discrimination laws, the Civil Rights Act that prohibit discrimination against both students, parents, and any staff person on the basis of race, religion, national origin, gender, and disability status. Yes, I think that's probably the synopsis of the regulations that they do.
That they do have to follow. Okay, thank you. Where can parents get help?
There's a lot of agencies that do provide representation for parents who who are need help with education issues. They can certainly use our good friend Google, which is a wonderful resource. But then there's also these other standalone legal resources like lawhelp.org.
Lawhelp.org.
Yes.
Right. So that's a good source of information.
They can go to that if they're looking for help for education law related issues or any legal matter that and typically they'll get a page that provides them referrals as well. Certainly they can contact our organization, Legal Services NYC. We have a separate hotline, citywide hotline. It's 917-661-4500. Our office provides free civil legal services to low-income families. So if you are over income, we wouldn't be able to represent you. However, you should certainly look into lawhelp.org to try to look for those resources as well.
Please give us that helpline one more time. I want to be sure that they got it.
Sure, it's 917-661-4500. There's also other agencies, as I mentioned before, like Advocates for Children.
Right.
Their information is included on the handout that came with your materials. There's also a general website that provides a clearinghouse of information for parents about education rights, and that's rightslaw.org, and that information is also in your materials.
That is helpful. So we've spent an awful lot of time discussing problems. Can you give parents a little advice so that they can get off to the best possible start and hopefully not have these problems?
Yes, I think, things that we've talked about before, really doing your research, know the schools that would be what their mission statement is, to see if they are a good fit for the type of student that your child is. Go to their websites, go visit the school, talk to other parents that may have children attending these schools. I think there are probably listservs or chat rooms out there for parents that go to some of these schools, and certainly try to, to get on those chat rooms. That would be helpful as well. An important document to look at is that family handbook. Every charter school has that family handbook. That handbook talks about their academic approach. It talks about their discipline policies, and that will give you a very good insight into the school's culture. Certainly, once you're there, you want to build good relationships with staff, and don't forget the other parents that attend the school as well, because oftentimes if something's happening to your child, it's likely you're not the only one. So, strength in numbers, that's always the case, and it's always better to raise issues with the state when it's more than just one person. And certainly going back to the Committee on Special Education. So if your child has a disability, it's important to have good relationships with the Committee on Special Education. Try to get to know the staff there, and try to be on good working terms.
One last question. Sooner or later, these charter schools will have to reapply to extend their charter, correct?
Yes. So once a charter school is authorized, that authorization lasts for a specific amount of time. And if the school wants to continue as a public charter school, it has to apply for reauthorization. And so in that process, parents and the community can weigh in on how that charter school is doing, and hopefully that can move the needle in terms of improving or congratulating the school for doing the right thing.
Right, exactly. I like that idea that the feedback from the public could influence it pro or con. I think that's a very important factor. Thank you. Thank you very much, Nelson. This has
You're
been
welcome,
very,
Jean.
very informative. A little frightening, but very, very informative. I want to thank all the viewers, and I want to remind you that we have our next live stream on February 14th. It's designed specifically for the parents of preschoolers, and it is called Curiosity, Bodies, and Touching. Please also go to our website for all of our events and activities. We also have a library of archived live streams there, so you'll never really miss one unless you want to. Thanks for joining us. See you next time.